Welcome to the morning show, broadcasting on Channel 9, as well as live streaming on Port Media's YouTube channel. And if you prefer to watch that way, you can go to www.ncmhub.org and just click on the YouTube icon in the upper right-hand corner. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm so pleased to welcome today's panel of three experts on suicide prevention, a timely and important topic. They're going to talk to us about who may be most vulnerable to suicidal thoughts, what warning signs we can all be alert to, how to raise the subject with people we might be worried about, and perhaps most importantly, what resources are available to those who might be at risk. They're also going to talk to us about the role of social justice and racial equity in suicide prevention and the ways in which racism impacts not only individuals, but also mental health systems as well. So let me give you a little introduction to my panel of experts here. Dr. Pata Suyemoto is a feminist scholar, writer, educator, diversity trainer, artist, and mental health activist. She's the co-chair of the Greater Boston Regional Suicide Prevention Coalition, a member of the program committee for the annual Asian American Mental Health Forum, and the chair of the People of Color Caucus of the Massachusetts Coalition for Suicide Prevention. Jennifer Kelliher is also here. She's the managing director of the Massachusetts Coalition for Suicide Prevention, a broad-based inclusive alliance of suicide prevention advocates from public and private agencies, as well as survivors of suicide loss and attempts working to reduce the incidence of suicide and self-harm. And Debbie Helms is also here. She's been the director of the Samaritans of Merrimack Valley for 15 years. It's a suicide prevention and postvention center and is a program of family services of the Merrimack Valley. Debbie's a member of the executive committee for the Mass Coalition for Suicide Prevention. She's co-chair of the Northeast Coalition for Suicide Prevention, and she's also a certified instructor in many suicide prevention and postvention trainings. And for those of you who may not be, as I wasn't familiar with the term postvention, it means what you logically might conclude that it means. Postvention is an organized response in the aftermath of suicide to facilitate the healing of individuals from the grief and distress of suicide loss. So Debbie, Jennifer, and Pata, first of all, welcome to the morning show, and thank you all so much for giving us of your time and your expertise today. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thanks for
My
having
pleasure.
us.
Thank you. Well, let's start with some of the news articles that I've been reading. There have been a lot of news reports. I'm sure everybody has seen about the pandemic's negative impacts on mental health in general, especially depression and anxiety. But recently I've seen more reports focused on public health experts' warnings about the danger of a rise in suicides. And I've also read then that historically, two of the most frequent factors when there are rises in suicides are economic downturns and social disconnection. And certainly those are both primary effects of the pandemic. So I wanted to start by getting your expert views on suicide prevalence and prevention. Have you observed or do you expect a rise in suicides? And if so, what do you see as the variables prompting that? Whoever would like to begin.
If it's okay, I think I'll tackle
Sure,
that first.
Debbie. Yeah.
I think that, first of all, we probably aren't going to see any research data on the increase for at least 2 years.
Yeah.
Because right now we work with data that is based on 2018. The World Health Organization is the one that captures all that data. They're a little busy right now, so
Yeah, they sure are.
could even be longer than that. I don't know,
Yeah.
but we're always working with data about 2 years in arrears. So we're not going to really, know what's going on. I think it's prevalent or pretty much assumed that there'll be a lot more people suffering from mental health issues because of the trauma involved with the COVID-19. I think, just to sum it up real quickly, I think COVID has given us and exacerbated stressors and things that we're living with already, and yet at the same time is taking away all those resources we used to use to keep ourselves mentally healthy.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
think that,
It's a perfect storm, in other words. Yeah.
it is. And suicide, we refer to that sometimes as the perfect storm as well, because it's not one thing that is the reason somebody takes their lives. So that's why we're going to talk about later the media recommendations, because unfortunately sometimes the media make it sound as if he was bullied and therefore he took his life, when we know that's not the case. So yeah, I think COVID is just really, as I said, exacerbated a lot of the warning signs and risk factors for suicide. You know, the loneliness, the isolation, unemployment, no insurance, can't get to medical or mental health treatment. And then you add on to that, you know, being confined and not being able to socialize at all, or even really pretty much go out of the house, and you may have kids. I think COVID has, and I think the other thing with COVID, in my opinion, is we still don't know when it's going to end.
Yeah, I think that's huge.
Trauma.
It's
Yeah.
the unendingness and the weird sense of time kind of passing, but
Mhm.
not really passing. My metaphor
Absolutely.
is it's time without any punctuation marks.
Mhm.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so it just, everything feels weird, and it's impossible to know when it will revert to whatever we used to think was normal.
Well, and it may not even be what we knew.
And
So
it may not be, and it
yeah.
probably won't be,
Yeah.
because we've all been changed by the pandemic.
Right.
So, well, thanks for that, Debbie. That's
Sure.
really interesting. So, Potter, did you have something you want to add?
Yeah. I mean, in communities of color, we know they've been impacted by the pandemic, both in terms of essential workers and disparities in healthcare and access to healthcare. And so, given that fact, even though, as Debbie mentioned, we don't have any real-time data, I mean, we could think that there might be a rise in suicides or substantial mental health impacts from these conditions in communities of color. So, we're keeping an
Yeah.
eye on that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So bottom line is there won't be any kind of definitive statistics on this for a couple of years because there's a built-in kind of lag time. But the concern is there, and the knowledge about the vulnerabilities are there. And there's a lot of vulnerabilities for all of us.
Right.
Well, you mentioned media and suicide, Debbie, and one thing I wanted to ask about was there have been some high profile suicides that have gotten a lot of media attention. There was a state finance minister in Germany who despaired over the virus's economic impact, and that suicide happened in March. And then there was a widely reported suicide of an emergency room physician who'd been on the front lines in Manhattan treating COVID patients, and that suicide happened in April. They were just heart-wrenching to hear about and made me wonder about the role of extreme stress, which of course both of these individuals were under in prompting suicidal thoughts and plans. So before we get to the media treatment, I wanted to ask you, what role does extreme stress play in suicide? Can it be a driver all on its own, or is it usually the result of other pre-existing factors in a person's life?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think what's happening is the stress, which is always a factor, a risk factor for suicide, along with a lot of others, is, as I said before, just getting exacerbated by COVID-19, the unknown, and all the life problems that are happening because of COVID-19. And so I think it's still there. I do want to say that there are a lot of reasons that a suicide happens. It's not because of one single thing. It's usually an underlying mental health issue or substance abuse issue. About 90% of people who die by suicide have that mental health challenge going on, or substance abuse challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And then you add all these life stresses on top of it. And that's when they can become suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
a lot, so is it a big factor? Absolutely. I think it always has been, but there are other factors that do contribute to somebody actually thinking about taking their life. So I
Mm-hmm.
think it's one piece of that.
Okay, that's helpful, Debbie. Jennifer or Potter, was there anything that you wanted to add to that? Or-
I
Okay,
I think
well,
Debbie covered it.
Yeah.
okay, good. Well, let's talk about the media treatment, though. Debbie, you sent me some very interesting written recommendations for reporting on suicide, and I learned a lot from them, including the fact that more than 50 research studies worldwide have found that certain types of news coverage can actually increase the likelihood of suicide in vulnerable individuals, and that the magnitude of the increase is related to the amount, the duration, and the prominence of the coverage. So that was eye-opening, really helpful to learn about that. And since media these days especially is engaged in not just by mainstream journalists, but by everybody who has a blog or a YouTube channel and all kinds of forms of social media, I hope that you might talk some about what are the best practices for how to communicate about suicide.
Sure, that's a great question as well. Just as a quick aside, when Marilyn Monroe died
Mhm.
by suicide, it was splashed all over the newspapers, and there was actually research that showed that suicide deaths increased 12% in the next 30 days.
I am old enough to remember that. I mean, I was
I know.
young, but I
You're not the
remember
only
it.
one.
It was immediate and everywhere and baffling. So
Versus
anyway, that's really interesting.
Kurt Cobain, when he died, his mother and his family and his wife came out and said, this is not the answer to mental health. This is not the answer to substance abuse issues. He was struggling with all these demons, and there was no increase in the suicide rate.
Wow, that's really
That's only
interesting.
one
Yeah,
of those 50
yeah.
studies. So,
Uh-huh.
so what we encourage media outlets, whether it's social media, whether it's the news on TV, what we're trying to do is work with as many of those media outlets as we can to basically show them different ways to be able to talk about suicide publicly without the fear of suicide contagion, without sensationalizing the suicide. One of the big things we've been working on for a number of years is trying to educate the community around using the word died by suicide instead of committed suicide.
Mm.
Committed suicide tends to lay blame to the person. It's, offensive to a lot of people who've lost somebody to suicide as well. And it just reinforces stigma. So we're trying to get away from the committed suicide and educate people on using the word died by, or the words died by suicide. That's one. Another one is obviously not sensationalizing it. That can, based on those studies, lead other vulnerable people to actually take their life. If they see this person getting all this attention, all these accolades
Yeah.
and stuff, and they're already struggling, they might be thinking, wow, if I do that, then people will really remember me, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not printing suicide notes in the paper or reading the suicide notes, just really thinking common sense wise about the safety of the people that you are talking to, that you are reaching. I think that's really what safety and good messaging guidelines boil down to. So, no photos. One of the other things that often happens is people call this the suicide epidemic. We're big in the suicide prevention field of using, more appropriate vocabulary and more appropriate terms.
Mm-hmm.
And so calling it epidemic automatically says, oh my God, it's out there. We can't do anything about it. It's horrible, which it is. Don't get me wrong. Every life matters, but it presents this picture of it's worse than possibly it really is. And so, using that word just sort of, again, stigmatizes suicide. And unfortunately, suicide is one of those subjects very few people want to talk about.
Yeah, those are such helpful and interesting distinctions. And I think the overarching kind of learning that I took away was it is a public health matter and needs to be dealt with the kind of the dignity
Absolutely.
and that kind of non-inflammatory and non-sensationalistic attitude of something that we're talking
Exactly.
about as a public health
Exactly.
issue. And I'm grateful to you for pointing out the language, because I just hadn't thought about it. I mean, I love language and words matter. So thinking about the difference between committing suicide, which sounds like an infraction somehow,
That's right.
and die
That's
by
right.
suicide, which properly focuses on our attention on the tragic loss. So thank you for
Exactly.
that, Debbie. That was really interesting. So, and I
Can I
learned
add
a
one
lot.
more thing about
Yeah,
social
absolutely.
distancing? Social distancing is something we're all sort of working on too, because again, we aren't socially distancing necessarily, we are physically distancing.
Yeah.
We still talk to our families and do Zoom meetings and all of that. And I think between that and seeing all the data every day and stuff, that is just making it much harder for people to deal with. the entire situation. So we're trying to educate people around physical distancing instead of social
Yes.
distancing too.
Right. That's absolutely right. Yeah. Well, one article that I read suggested that during a pandemic or other national crisis, it becomes even more important for all of us in the community to be the eyes and ears of suicide prevention. And if so, it helps to know what we're looking for, what we're listening for, what signs should draw our attention, our concern about the potential for suicide.
Sure. Another great question. I mentioned earlier, you have wonderful questions for us. So
I try. Thank you.
yes, thank you. Yeah, I think it kind of boils down to, there's a lot of risk factors around family history of mental health and suicide, dysfunctional families, alcoholism, being male, because 80% of all suicide deaths are males. So there's a lot of those risk factors that really you can't do anything about. They're innate, they're there. I think when you get to the warning signs, which are more the behavioral and mood signs that can maybe signal something is wrong, that's what kind of we're talking about. It's really can be summed up basically by, are there any severe behavior changes for the person you know? Are they acting differently? Are they, hopeless? I think hopeless and burdensomeness, feeling like a burden, are probably very important. We run an attempt support group for people who have attempted suicide and survived. And I think that's what I'm finding from all of the members, that those are two very common, feelings before they get to the point where they want to take their life, or they do take their life. And I think, so changes in behavior, a lot of them are similar to depression sign warnings, changes in eating habits, sleeping habits, maybe self-medicating with alcohol or drugs more. Just basically, isolating. It's hard to say isolating. When I was going through this yesterday, I'm thinking, how do we tell that now as a warning sign? Because everybody has to. So I think it's more the lack of being able to be social. Community events aren't being held, the sports aren't being held, it's all different for us. So I think that, again, that just increases those behaviors. So I think, as I said, it's not complicated. I shouldn't say that. I take that back. Because I don't want to make it sound simple, because certainly suicide is not, it's very serious. And as I said, everybody counts. But I think if people get educated around the warning signs and risk factors, and just a few can save somebody's life. They're different. Their mood is different. They aren't talking to you as much. They don't want to do Zoom with you anymore. They don't have a sense of purpose. They feel lost or trapped, for example. They're not engaging in anything that's available to them. Loss of interest in everything they've been doing. And that's another one that's kind of hard to tell because of COVID and being isolated. But, I challenge people to think about what made them happy and what did they do to be joyous and happy before COVID. And a lot of that you can't get back yet. But I think there are things that we can do to sort of mitigate some of those warning signs. I think it behooves us in this day and age to not put self-care last, but to make it a priority.
Yeah. Well, that makes perfect sense, Debbie. And what you're focusing on is really, it's being alert to significant changes.
Right.
And we all have a felt sense of what it's like to be with somebody when people have a range of moods, but if it's somebody we know well, we know what that range is. And so it's really trying to detect something that feels significant. And along those lines, then, I wanted to ask you, somebody may notice something, a change the way you do. And I often have heard people express reluctance to ask a person, are you thinking of hurting yourself? Are you having suicidal thoughts? Because they're concerned about embarrassing the person. They're afraid they might be wrong. They don't want to be offensive. And so I would love to find out, what would you suggest if somebody is using their eyes and ears and their senses, something's going on here? What would you say to somebody who might initially feel reluctant to bring it up with somebody? Should they? And if so, how?
There's no doubt, and I think any of our minds in the suicide prevention field, that yes, if you see somebody struggling and that's not like them, and you can see the other signs as well. People ask, do you have extra pills that you don't need? The means restriction is extremely important as well. So I think what I would say to people is it's mostly fear-based that people don't ask, and it's the stigma. A lot of people are fearful that they're going to get a yes answer and not know how to answer it. Well, here's the answer. Ask the question, and you just simply say to them, listen, I've noticed this, this, and this about you, and I'm worried about your safety. You know, you want to talk about what's going on. The bottom line is you could be saving a life by opening up that conversation. And research tells us that a lot of people are relieved that somebody is willing to talk about it, because a lot of people just ignore, for whatever reason, all those reasons you said as well. They're afraid to ask the question because they might say yes, they, you know, think they're intruding. Well, let me ask you, and let me challenge you, please intrude, because it's important. I mean, communication and talking about it is a very effective way to prevent suicides. Don't worry about saying things wrong. You know, just be open and honest and non-judgmental, and don't make it about you. Truly sit there and listen actively to the person.
Yeah. And you may
And I think
wind
it's
up,
important to note
go
that,
ahead.
you know, asking the question isn't going to put the thought in somebody's head. It really is
Oh,
just a relief to allow somebody to be able to talk about it and to know that you're a safe person to be there as a resource. And I think it's also really important in acknowledging we all have a role to play, and acknowledging that it's really important for us to know the signs and risk factors, that those risk factors and warning signs might appear different in different communities. So communities of color might experience suicidality in different ways, and in a way that as a field in suicidology, we haven't really studied a lot. So I think it's really important to pay attention to that, and to really listen to the communities themselves. As, you know, what are some risk signs that you've noticed are common?
Oh, absolutely. But the bottom line to what you're saying is just ask, because the potential benefit of saving somebody's life clearly far outweighs any fear that you might feel
Absolutely.
about being
Absolutely.
offensive.
Absolutely.
And also that if you don't ask, you know, it occurs to me based on what you're saying that what you're doing then is you're underscoring the feeling of disconnection, because somebody
Absolutely.
who is having that kind of crisis or those kind of intense feelings is really in need of feeling that somebody cares about them, and so to ask is a signal of caring. Kind of just along those lines. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, I read an article, another article. I did some preparation for this interview, and so I did read one article that said that sometimes in response to extreme stress or discouragement, and we've been talking about how much of that is going around now, entertaining a suicidal thought, for example, oh, I could just end it all, you know, can sometimes provide a temporary escape for a person. But the article I was reading was saying that you have to monitor your thoughts because that can be a slippery slope. And I wondered if you agreed with that assessment that it can be a slippery slope. And if so, what alternate escapes or distractions or types of self-care would you encourage as a substitute?
First of all, I wouldn't, that does work for some people who have chronic suicidal thinking or have attempted suicide and have survived. That really first came out several years ago with Terry Wise, who wrote this wonderful book. She used to go out and speak publicly. Now I think she's kind of cut back on that. Her book called Waking Up, Climbing Through the Darkness. If anybody is interested in reading that concept, that's what her clinician did. Left it on the table instead of saying, no, you can't do this, taking it off and not making an option. And for her, it worked, and it worked well. I don't think anybody should be, this is my own personal opinion, I don't think anybody should be recommending that to a friend or anybody else, because I think that requires professional help. I do think a lot of people, you know, think about it, and it's sort of that theory that, like, if you're on a diet and you know you can't have ice cream, what do you usually crave? Ice cream, right? That can permeate your thoughts. And so I think it is effective for some people, but I wouldn't consider doing it unless you're under the care of a mental health professional. I think it is a distraction. I think another good alternative to that is to come up with a safety plan, where people are aware of the fact that It helps them not only figure out when they're getting into that deep, dark place, but what can I do about distracting myself? You know, how can I take care of that personally? Go out for a walk, hug my kids, whatever it is. And, you know, both outside the house, well, it's a little tough to do that now, but, or inside the house, what can I do for distraction? And
Yeah.
you have them there. And I'll talk about an app that's really beneficial for a lot of people. And then, you know, who can I call that won't judge me and that kind of stuff. And,
Mhm.
Yeah.
you know, you go down the list and of this
Yeah.
safety plan, it's a very easy to do on an app called My3 app. And so I think having that is a great help to the
Mhm.
distraction end of constantly thinking about suicide or thinking of it as an
Mm,
option.
mm. And I mean, as an attempt survivor myself and a person who lives with depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, I live with suicidal thoughts. I do, and but I've learned to understand when I need an increased level of treatment. I've been in therapy a long time, and I've learned to monitor myself, and that
Mm.
self-awareness,
Mhm.
the learning how to be really in tune with when you start going down the rabbit hole, you
Yeah.
know, and then having a plan of what you do, like Debbie said, a safety plan of some sort.
Mhm.
And I mean, I've learned to reach out. And I've also learned that, you know, there's lots of things that I can do to intervene,
Mhm.
you know, and there's,
Mhm.
you know, lots of ways I can try to shift my thinking a little bit to be
Mhm.
able to cope better.
Mhm.
And I think, you know, that self-awareness is critical. And, you know, sometimes you need other people to help you with that too.
Mhm.
You know, another person, a close friend, a romantic partner, someone might say, you know, it seems like you're thinking more about this now. Because sometimes I think we're not even aware of where our thinking is going right away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
So,
that's really interesting and helpful, Pata. And at the end, we're going to go back and I'm going to ask all of you for more resources. So we'll come back to that at the end. But bottom line of what you're saying is, you know, just be careful and be thoughtful, and have a plan. Be prepared is also part of what you're saying. And so we'll come back to some of the resources at the end. But what I wanted to shift to now is it's come to my awareness fortuitously. This is July is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And so I wanted to raise that topic as well, because when I was doing my research on suicide prevention, looking for people such as yourselves to come on the morning show, I noticed a resource listed on the website for the Mass Coalition to Prevent Suicide called, and this got my attention, Widening the Lens, Exploring the Role of Social Justice and Racial Equity in Suicide Prevention. And during these times of increased awareness of the urgency of working toward racial justice, I thought this would be really interesting and important to explore. And then I learned further that Pata and Jennifer have put together a racial equity toolkit on the topic. And you can get to that toolkit, by the way, on that website. So Pata and Jennifer, when we do widen the lens on suicide prevention to include this focus, what are we then able to see?
That's a great question. I think when we widen the lens, we can see that there really isn't any such thing as an objective approach to mental health, that all of our approaches to mental health are shaped by the way our institutions and organizations are molded by the society they exist in. And in this case, that is a predominantly white society. We tend to think that only people in certain identity groups have specific lenses or cultural contexts that impact their view of the world, and also tend to forget that this is also true of people in the groups who we normalize as the default, who have the most power in many aspects of our society, and that includes mental health. So as a normally white field, I think it's easy to forget that whiteness is also a lens, and it also shapes our approaches, our interventions, and our work, and that approach wasn't arrived at because it's the most efficient or the most effective. And what happens when these systems go unexamined is that groups with the most power to shape the system are the same groups that end up validating the efforts within that system. So in order to truly be equitable as a field, as an organization, coalitions and communities trying to reduce mental distress and suicide attempts and fatalities need to really understand that our current approaches don't work for everyone. And that in order to reach BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in their communities, we need to do several things. First, we have to elevate BIPOC voices and the voices of in the voices of BIPOC individuals and communities in suicide prevention,
Mhm.
both through empowering organizations that already serve BIPOC communities, but also through ensuring that each of our organizations have the same commitment to elevating the voices of BIPOC within our suicide prevention work. But in order to do that, we have to make sure our organizations are working towards equity. So the second thing we have to do is examine our own organizations and understand how our structures function to uphold systemic oppression. And we need to do everything we can to ensure that those systems are changed so that we're really working towards being actively anti-racist in all of our efforts and towards our structures and operations.
Yeah, so in other words, when you open up the lens, what you see is a lot that expands, our definition of, who is in the system, how it got framed,
Exactly.
how the vision is limited, and what we need to do, as you were just articulating, Jennifer, what we need to do in order to open up the lens so that everybody is included. Um, and in your toolkit, in fact, it points out that the effects of racism aren't just within individuals, but they are, as you've been saying, in our systems, including mental health and suicide prevention systems. So how do oppressive systems create additional barriers for people of color to find resources, for example, during a suicide crisis?
Right, right. The systems that create oppression are embedded in the norms and approaches and interventions that were taught in suicide prevention. Um, and this means that when we encourage help seeking, we encourage very specific modality of help seeking and ignore really where that modality falls short for people of color. So even when people are directed to the interventions we promote, they may not be able to address the mental health concerns of BIPOC in a culturally
Mhm.
relevant way. So one of the things we need to do really is begin to pay attention to how to be culturally relevant, culturally humble in our approaches when we dealing with BIPOC individuals and communities. And these inequities, the systems of oppressions create inequities in access to healthcare, transportation, linguistic barriers, and other
Mhm.
obstacles in finding a resource during a crisis. So again, we have to look at the larger system to understand that, why we're not reaching individuals.
Yeah.
And thirdly, we do not provide support or resources to organizations that are already serving BIPOC
Mm.
communities in a culturally relevant way. A lot of times these organizations are very small. I was talking to someone recently about how sometimes they're so small they can't even really apply for grants and things like that.
Oh,
So they're really underfunded. And this means the organizations that are out there that are doing the work in reaching BIPOC communities around mental health are working with far less funding and less capacity than those that are serving predominantly white communities. So again, we have to think about resources and capacity, and
yeah.
what we're doing to help elevate those organizations that
Yeah.
are working hard.
Absolutely. Your toolkit included some eye-opening statistics for me. It said that while 48% of white people who with mental illness receive mental health services, only 31% of Blacks and Hispanics and only 22% of Asian Americans receive services. And that's such a striking difference and really disconnect. I also saw the report said that Asian American adults are less likely to use mental health services than
Hmm.
any other racial
Hmm.
and ethnic groups. So I'd love to hear more about, you've been, said some things already about how these disparities arose, but any other insights into
Hmm.
um, why these disparities exist and have continued to exist, and some thoughts about additional thoughts about how we can sort of equalize
Hmm.
opportunities for mental health
So first, I
access.
mean, there in many communities of color, there's a distrust of the medical establishment.
Mm.
So if you start there, how likely are you to go to a psychiatrist if you feel like they're not going to understand, if they're not going to, or you've had experience with the medical establishment that has been harmful,
Mhm.
you know.
Yes.
Um, and there's stigmatization in communities of color of people with mental illness, with suicidal ideation, and this, that silence and that stigma is real, and we have to work within our own communities. I mean, for example, in Asian American community, mental health is generally not talked about, and in some Asian language, there isn't a word for depression. So,
Oh,
I
that
mean,
I did
so
not know
there's
that. That's
ways that
interesting.
it's very difficult to access. And now you have to realize that the Western construction of what mental health is not necessarily the way other communities understand it too. So there's a disconnect there. There's also lack of practitioners of color, and even white practitioners with cultural humility who
Mhm.
understand how to approach a person with color with relevant care.
Mhm.
Um, and in some communities of color, there's a access to affordable mental health services, and that really varies community to community in terms of how well they're insured and those kinds of things. So there's a lot of issues that go
Yeah.
into why these statistics look the way they do currently. And I think we
Yeah.
have a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Yeah, Pata, I would love it if you could expand on the idea of cultural humility a little bit more. I
Hmm.
was familiar with the phrase cultural competence
Hmm.
because there's workshops on that. It's kind of out there in the zeitgeist. But and I know the phrase cultural humility is out there as well. I just was not as familiar with it. And to
Hmm.
me, humility is a form by itself. Humility is a sign of higher intelligence. I think maybe the highest form of human intelligence. And so I was so intrigued to see that phrase, cultural humility. And I was hoping that you've referenced it in what you were saying, but I was hoping that you could say a little bit more about what it means, why it's important, and maybe give an example of how it applies to mental health and suicide prevention.
Sure. So out there in cultural competence, the idea of cultural competence is the idea that we can learn enough to be competent in a culture, which I think personally is impossible. How can you
Mm,
be really competent in someone else's culture, without being in that culture, without having growing up with the values and the norms
hmm.
and the language, etc.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's arrogant to think that we can be culturally competent and then, go in with that knowledge and know and think we know. Cultural humility kind of turns that on its head and says, well, we need to ask. We need to be curious. We need to let the person of color or the person with the experience describe to us what that experience is and validate that experience and understand that we cannot know what it is to walk in their shoes, and that's okay. It
Hmm.
doesn't mean we can't help them. It means that we can actually listen and try to understand their worldview and their understanding of their own illness or whatever's going on with them. And I mean, that's just the basics of cultural humility. And I think that, when clinicians or when we in general approach others with that sort of questioning stance and not referring it back to the not dominant culture norm, like, okay, it is its own beautiful cultural perspective that person has. And I think that that's what cultural humility is really about. I mean, and in terms of an example, well, just in a personal note, um my I've been in the mental health system since I was about 16, and I'm old now. And and the thing is that only until about 10 years ago did anyone ask how my cultural background as a Japanese American person affected my mental health. You have to realize my dad was interned during World War II. There's historical trauma throughout our family. So I mean, and it's astonishing if you think about it,
It is astonishing.
you
Absolutely.
know. And so if someone had been more, sort of culturally humble, that question would have come up a long time ago,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and that would have gone into how my treatment was explored.
Yeah. Oh, that's really fascinating, Pata. And I love the way you describe cultural humility, which seems like a profound idea and a key to being able to be effective,
Mhm.
actually, in really understanding another person and how to even begin trying to be helpful to them. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Um,
Jen, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I think to me, the biggest difference is that cultural humility really encourages us to ask not only what inequities exist, but also why they exist, and then what we can do about them. It's an understanding that identifying these inequities creates a responsibility to address and dismantle them, whereas cultural competence is based on a more superficial understanding, and it really assumes that adjusting language and acknowledging inequity is actually kind of enough.
Mhm.
It doesn't really recognize the deeper systemic changes that need to happen, but can often assume that just acknowledging the problem is a solution instead of a first
Mhm.
step. And I think with mental health and suicide prevention, we see all the time, materials being translated word for word into other languages to try to meet the needs of many different cultures. And that would fall under cultural competence. But many adjustments need to be made to our materials, interventions, and trainings and approaches to be both linguistically and culturally responsive. And
Mhm.
both, I think, are equally important. And so that means, as Pata was saying, that we need to elevate the expertise of BIPOC and BIPOC communities,
Mhm.
understanding that we as white people can never be experts in that experience. We can never achieve competence.
Mhm.
But in continuing to be humble, we can understand that by elevating the voices and expertise of BIPOC communities, we can actually come up with materials, resources, and efforts that are meaningful to those communities.
Mhm.
And as a field, I think we need to really, take into account that expertise a lot more than we currently do. And that can range from asking a community, what language do you use around mental health and suicide prevention? As Pata mentioned, in some Asian languages, there isn't a word for depression. So
Mhm.
how is it described?
Mhm.
And what language also should be avoided? In some cultures, there is, language that we might use that is absolutely, you should not use. And
Right.
also, I think more importantly, what interventions are meaningful to you and your community? And also what sources of resilience and strength are culturally appropriate, that can be specific protective factors for your community and individuals in
Right.
your community.
Yeah, I'm thinking as you're talking that cultural humility can take us a bit closer to wisdom, in
Mhm.
other
Mhm.
words. Thank you for that. That's really fascinating and really important. I also was struck in the toolkit, and this seems related to what you've just been talking about. There's a statement that stood out to me that in communities of color, considering the effects of racism and addressing racism is a form of suicide prevention.
Mhm.
And I was hoping that you could expand on that and give an example.
Sure. Now we know that suicide, as Debbie was talking about, is never caused by just one thing. Um, but we do know that trauma and stress can be risk factors, like we were talking about before. And racism is a trauma, basically. I mean, if we think about it that way, that BIPOC have to live with every day. And it's so you get from microaggressions to larger systemic erasure to the physical, emotional violence. People of color are faced with racial trauma and unequivocally impacts our mental well-being. In some cases, this can mean exposure to racial trauma that can create suicidal ideation and it can lead to suicide attempts. And because of this, when we address racism or other systemic oppressions, we are doing suicide prevention
Mm.
because we're working to remove or mitigate risk factors that lead to suicidal thinking or attempts. Um, and for example, in my life, racism has affected my life intergenerationally and in real time. And that stress is, a known stress for suicidal thinking. Intergenerationally, as I said, my father was interned in the World War II, and that has impacts going down. And then there's studies that show that the impact of intergenerational trauma is real. And then, in real time, we have COVID right now, and there's an uptick in anti-Asian um, sentiment and
Right.
racism against Asian Americans. And I've
Yeah.
I've experienced that personally in
Mm.
Massachusetts. You know, um, through comments, through people jumping out of my way. I mean, just sort of very and that this the stress can particularly when like of the individual myself who has underlying conditions can increase the likelihood that something that I might make a suicide attempt or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, and we can't, there's lots of things, as Debbie said, there's lots of things we can't eliminate as risk factors,
Hmm.
but racism I think is one of the ones we can. If we
Hmm.
worked on it, we could
Hmm.
really we could work on racism and be able to ameliorate some of the impacts it has on individuals of color.
Yeah. Yeah, to do that though, we have to take it into consideration, which is the point
Yes.
that you're making. You're talking about the the traumatizing effects of experiencing racism. And part of the toolkit that also was intriguing to me was the concept of, you used the phrase that captivated my attention, shattered assumptions, and the role that plays in trauma response work. So I was hoping that you might maybe give us an example of what you mean by shattered assumptions and how that factors into trauma response work, especially as it relates to suicide prevention.
Sure. Jen, do you want to take it? You want me to?
Um, you can go for it if you want.
Sure. So we're just,
Sure,
yeah.
no, that's fine. Yeah.
So shattered assumptions, I think maybe the best way is to do an example. So lots of people many people in the dominant culture feel that the police are there to protect the community,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But what we've seen recently with the murders of African American people by the police and is that this is not true for all people in all communities. And when people in the dominant culture realize that, it shatters the assumption that they had that this was true for everyone, right? So
Yeah.
the idea that we have these certain assumptions about life that given a certain experience gets shattered, right? We all of a sudden, our worldview has to change because we have new information that make us realize that this is not an equitable society and it's not the same for everybody. So that's really the idea of shattered assumptions. And I think one of the things that makes it very uncomfortable for people in the dominant culture, for white people to look at issues of racism is because a lot of the assumptions about how people are treated, what access they have become shattered assumptions. And when that happens, there's a cognitive dissonance. It's like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
my world is now disrupted.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think in trauma response, COVID-19, unfortunately, is a great example of trauma because, for example, on March 15th, we all got up, did our normal things. We were happy. We knew the world was safe. We were, had a purpose and all of that. And on March 16th, obviously, all of those assumptions were like taken away.
Yeah.
The world is not as safe as it was.
Yeah.
It's not as meaningful. Am I going to be able to function in this new world of ours?
Yeah.
So it's more in a grander scale on as far as trauma, not that what Pata was talking about certainly is trauma. And it's a great example. I love that example. But in a bigger worldwide sort of scope of things with COVID, I think that's what it's talking about. We were safe, we were functional, we were happy, we knew what we were doing, and that, we just had that underlying assumption. And then something like COVID comes along, we're no longer functional. We don't know what's going on, and our foundation basically is shattered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did, every day I watch the news and my assumptions are shattered, quite honestly, especially these days. So it's an ongoing assumption shattering, and it appears that there's no bottom. So I want to make sure that we have time to talk about the resources because that's critical. And so Debbie, could you talk to us about the Samaritans? Give the
Sure.
phone number for sure, and talk about what people might experience when they call the Samaritans, and then other resources that any of you would like people to know about. Let's go there now. So.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, we run a crisis helpline, suicide crisis helpline, and we have an 800 number, which is 866-912-4673, and a local number, which is 978-327-6607. There is also the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which actually right now we're in the process of becoming accredited so that we can be one of their call centers. And that number is 800-273-8255. I think that there are plenty of resources out there. I mean, I think one of the things I would like people to think about, similar to what Pata and Jennifer are talking about, is the mental health aspect of this and the trauma aspect of this. And is the world really prepared to be able to serve all the people that are going to need that help? And I think advocating for more funding. I mean, we know of some mental health organizations that have, had to close their doors because of a lack of funding. So just as an aside, please pay attention. And I think we need to get prepared, just like they're doing the serum now for COVID. We need to start acting now on being able to handle the effects of this, both for mental health and unfortunately suicide too. So sorry, I didn't mean to get off on that, but I think
No, I think that,
important.
Debbie, that is such an important point because yes, I mean, we are all, we're gonna, it is gonna be massive. So anyway, that's a great point to be thoughtful and to plan ahead. Yeah.
There's a lot of websites out there, stop-suicide.org. Is our website. Masspreventsuicide.org is the statewide coalition website. There's other ones to get great information, suicidology.org, AFSP, which is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the Trevor Project, which is a terrific project out in the western part of the United States. It's primarily for LGBTQ youth. They do a lot of work around that. I mentioned a couple of apps before, the My3 app. Just go on to your app thing and, the store, and you'll find it. It's wonderful. It's personalized. You can change it. You can update it. A lot of people use that as sort of a safety plan, which is what it was designed for. There's another one called the Virtual Hope Box, which it's a wonderful thing too. It allows you to put in items or music or faces or pictures of things that when that dark cloud is coming, you open up your hope box and it sort of hopefully gives you reasons for continuing to struggle and hopefully get better. So
what a great idea.
It is.
I love the idea of a hope box.
Yeah, we actually made physical hope boxes with my attempt support group.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was therapeutic. Yeah,
that's brilliant. That's great.
So there's a lot of information out there. Put in suicide prevention, you'll get millions of things. I'd also like to offer my email, if that's okay.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Because I'm happy if somebody needs more information or doing a project or really has a specific interest in this field. It's D Helms. You can see it on the thing. D Helms at FSMV, Family Service Merrimack Valley, FSMV.org. And I would be happy to help with anybody that's out there that would like more information, maybe around specific groups that are more at high risk for suicide, to just talking to somebody who maybe recently lost somebody to suicide.
So I have a couple.
Yeah, go ahead, Pata. No.
I was just saying there's a couple additionals.
Absolutely.
So there is an organization called Dee Dee's Cry. It's more of an educational organization for African Americans, mostly in Roxbury and Dorchester. And they can be found on Facebook, actually. And the Arredondo Foundation is another organization that works mostly with veterans, but the executive director is Latinx, and also lots of their work is in Spanish. And I just want to put a little plug in for, Debbie gave Mass Prevent Suicide, which is the MCSP's website, but we also, the Alliance for Equity. And if people are interested in working on equity issues in suicide prevention, they should contact Jen and I. We have a white ally caucus and a people of color caucus together, and we work together to work on racial equity, social justice, and suicide prevention. So that's the MCSP Alliance for Equity at gmail.com if anyone wants to get in touch with us around that.
And if I could just
go ahead.
Sorry, Mary.
No, go ahead.
We also run two support groups called Safe Place for people who have lost somebody to suicide.
Oh, great.
They're both virtual, but they're all both up and running. And we also run one of the very few attempt support groups in the state. And those are still being done periodically virtually. those I'm finding are a lot better in person, as well as the loss survivor groups.
Zoom is great, but like email, it's not great for everything. So
No,
yeah,
no. So that's one of the things I've learned about COVID. Some of our groups really
yeah,
it's better in person.
yeah,
So you can give them hugs and support and stuff.
yeah,
But I
absolutely.
just wanted to mention that there are
Yeah.
some in the Northeast area here in the Merrimack Valley area, one's in Beverly and one's in North Andover. But now that we're virtual, we can go anywhere. So that's the positive of that.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for explaining all of those different resources. And just to mention, there is another resource that the FCC just approved, and that's a 3-digit 988 suicide hotline. It's not online yet because phone companies have 2 years to get that service up and running. But the
Excellent.
idea is that just as 911 is easy to remember, 988 for suicide prevention will, within the next couple of years, be online and easy enough to remember. I want to end today by thanking you all, but I
Could
want
I
to
just
start.
add one thing to that, Mary? I know
Yeah,
we're on time, but I want to also point out that we're also hoping that by having a 988 number, rather than National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, it'll decrease a lot of the stigma. I mean, people call 911,
yes.
they call 211. Hopefully in the suicide prevention field, we're hoping that having that just very destigmatized number is
Yeah.
going to encourage more people to reach out for help, and just make asking for help more of a priority without the stigma and the fear
Yeah.
attached to it. So
That would be a great outcome, Debbie. Thank you for adding that. Well, Debbie, at the end of your email is a phrase that caught my attention. I'm going to end with that. It says, suicide is not chosen. It happens when pain exceeds the resources for coping with the pain. And so I want to thank all three of you for taking the time out to visit the morning show and sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and for making it possible for there to be resources that can help people make sure that their pain does not exceed the resources available to them. So thank you, Pata. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Debbie, for visiting the morning show today. It was a delight. I learned so much from having you here. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Yes,
you.
we appreciate the
Bye-bye.
opportunity.
Oh, my privilege. I've learned so much. So thank you very much. Well, thanks for watching, everybody. That's it for today's morning show. I hope you'll join us next Thursday when I'm going to be welcoming back to the show historian and educator Susan Harvey. She was on the show last July to talk about her fascinating research on what's called the triangle trade, slavery, sugarcane, and rum, and how Newburyport's economy was entangled with slavery. So I asked her back next week to talk about the Black Lives Matter protests and whether or not, as some have speculated, we are experiencing another great awakening in U.S. history, similar to the Great Awakening that Susan taught me about last time she was on the show, that was connected with the Grimke sisters in the first half of the 19th century, which helped launch the abolitionist movement. She'll also talk with us about the ongoing unfinished struggle for Reconstruction in America and how it impacts our current quest for racial justice. I'll also be delighted to welcome two guests who can fill us in on the exciting sound and light show launching now at Castle Hill on the Crane Estate. Castle Hill Illuminated, as it's called. Cultural site manager Robin Donovan Bocchiaro and lighting designer Chris Bocchiaro will be here to talk about this 35-minute multi-sensory spectacle happening nights during July and August. If you missed part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show. Go to www.ncmhug.org and click on the icon in the upper right-hand corner. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. and then again the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. and then will be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Click on the cloud icon once again at www.ncmhub.org and then scroll down. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Hope to see you back here next Thursday at 9 a.m. Bye for now.
Take care.